They were just children when they first noticed how quiet the nights could be. In their small village, where no streetlights glowed and the houses were made of mud and stone, the sky looked bigger than anywhere else. Every evening, after the day's work was done and their parents rested, the two siblings would climb up to the flat roof of their home. They would lie side by side, staring into the endless dark sky scattered with stars. To most people in their village, the stars were nothing unusual. They were simply part of the night, distant lights that had no real meaning. But to these two children, the stars were alive. Each twinkle felt like a secret message. Each constellation felt like a story waiting to be told. They would whisper to each other, giving the stars their own names, sometimes imagining them as guardians, sometimes as friends. They had no books, no telescope, not even a map of the sky. Yet in their minds they were travelers. They believed the stars could take them far away, beyond the dusty roads of their village, beyond the poverty and the smallness that surrounded them. While other children dreamed of becoming farmers or shopkeepers, they dreamed of becoming something nobody in their village had ever heard of, astronomers. But dreams in their world were dangerous. People around them believed dreaming too big was a kind of foolishness, even arrogance. Their father would often shake his head, saying, "You should focus on real life, not the sky. Stars won't feed you." Their mother loved them, but she too worried. She would tell them gently, "It's better to keep your eyes on the ground. The sky is too far away." And then there were the neighbors. They laughed when they saw the children looking up at the night sky for hours. "There they go again," some would whisper, chasing stars as if they can touch them. Children in the village mocked them too, calling them dreamers, sometimes even pushing them aside when they tried to join games. For the siblings, the stars that once felt like home slowly turned into a reason for isolation. Their classmates didn't want to sit with them. Teachers scolded them for drawing constellations in their notebooks instead of copying lessons. Even during festivals, when families gathered in joy, someone would point at them and say, "These two think they belong to the stars. They don't belong to us." They were too young to explain themselves, too young to defend their passion. All they knew was that the world they lived in was growing smaller while their dream was growing larger. The older sibling, though only a teenager, began to feel the heavy weight of disappointment. He tried to bury his dreams by helping more in the fields, carrying water or assisting with household work. But every time he looked at the night sky, he felt that same fire burning inside. He could not let go. His younger sister was even more stubborn. She would collect scraps of paper, torn pages from old school books, and sketch the stars with charcoal. "If the world won't give us books, we'll make our own," she would say with a quiet smile. Their small acts of defiance only made people talk more. Soon they were no longer seen as just odd children, they were seen as outcasts. At school, teachers told them to stop wasting time. When they tried to borrow books from the town library, the librarian looked at them with disbelief. "What will children like you do with these?" he asked. Day by day, they felt the distance growing, not just between them and their village, but between them and the stars they loved. Because now, every time they looked up, they also remembered the mocking words, the laughter, the rejection. The stars were supposed to bring comfort, yet they had become the reason for their loneliness. One evening, after a long day of ridicule, they sat quietly on the roof. The younger one asked, "Why do they hate us for loving the stars?" The older one had no answer. He could only whisper, "Maybe the stars are too far away. Maybe we are not meant to reach them." For the first time, silence hung between them. The stars twinkled above, but the children no longer felt their warmth. They felt banished, not by the universe itself, but by the people who could not understand. Still deep inside, a small flame remained. Even though the world tried to pull them down, the memory of countless nights spent tracing constellations refused to die. That flame was fragile, but it was there, hidden like a secret between the two of them. Life carried on. The boy worked harder in the fields to support his family. The girl stayed in school, though each day was a battle against doubt and discouragement. Yet every night, no matter how tired or humiliated they felt, they climbed back to the roof. They did not speak much anymore, but lying under the vast sky gave them strength. The stars, even in silence, still belonged to them, and so, in the heart of rejection, a story began. A story of two dreamers, banished by the stars in the eyes of their world, yet still holding on to the hope that one day, Somewhere, they might find a place where their love for the universe would not be mocked but welcomed. The days after that felt heavier. The world did not suddenly grow kinder to the two siblings. In fact, it became even harder. The boy, who had already left school, spent his mornings and evenings working in the fields. The land was rough and the sun was harsh. His hands became calloused, his shoulders sore from carrying heavy loads. Sometimes he would look up at the wide sky, but before he could let his eyes wander too long, someone would call out, "Stop daydreaming. Work with your hands, not your head." He would bow quietly and return to the soil. The girl, meanwhile, was determined to continue school. Every day she walked several kilometers along a dusty road to the small building that served as her classroom. She carried her books in a cloth bag and often studied while walking, even if other children laughed at her. "Why bother?" they teased. "You will end up like everyone else here." She never answered. But inside, their words cut deep. At school, she faced more than just teasing. Teachers often showed little patience with her questions. Whenever she asked about planets, the solar system, or the mysteries of the universe, they frowned. "Stick to the textbook," they said. "Stop wasting time with nonsense." The truth was simple. She was too curious for a world that valued survival over imagination. In the evenings, the two would meet on the rooftop as they always had. The boy, tired from the field, sometimes lay down silently. The girl, though exhausted from school and mockery, would still bring her scraps of paper. She sketched the stars, the moon's phases, and even tried to write down her own theories. Some nights they argued. The boy would sigh, "What's the use? Nobody listens. Nobody cares. We'll never leave this place." But she always answered softly, "If nobody listens, then we'll listen to each other." This simple promise kept them going. Still, their lives were filled with struggle. They had no telescope, not even a pair of binoculars. Their school library was too small to have books about astronomy. Internet was unheard of in their village. All they had were cheap notebooks, pencils, and their eyes. But sometimes determination is stronger than resources. The girl discovered that the town library, though far away, had some science books. She convinced her brother to go with her. They walked miles to reach the library, their feet dusty, their clothes plain compared to the city children. When they asked for astronomy books, the librarian stared at them with disbelief. "Do you even understand these things?" he asked, half laughing. The boy felt embarrassed, ready to walk away, but the girl stood firm. "Please, just give us a chance." After much hesitation, the librarian handed them an old book about the solar system. It was worn out with missing pages, but to them it was treasure. They carried it home like it was gold. That night, they stayed awake under the lantern's weak light, reading about planets, stars, and galaxies. Their eyes sparkled with excitement, and for a moment the mockery of the world didn't matter. But dreams don't always grow smoothly. Every time they showed interest in studies, their family grew anxious. The boy's father scolded him. "You must work harder in the fields. What good will these star stories bring to us?" The girl's mother begged her, "Don't spend so much time on useless reading. Learn something practical." It hurt them deeply because they loved their parents and did not want to disappoint them. But how could they kill the dream that gave them life? Even worse, poverty pushed them further down. Some days there was barely enough food on the table. The boy often went to bed hungry so his younger sister could eat. The girl stitched old notebooks together because they could not afford new ones. Rain leaked through their roof during the monsoon, wetting their precious papers, forcing them to dry the pages under the sun. Yet in those moments of struggle, they held on to hope. One evening, after a particularly harsh day, the boy returned from the fields and found his sister crying quietly over her notebooks. The children at school had torn one of her star drawings, laughing at her. He sat beside her, took the broken pages, and said, "Don't cry. They laugh now, but one day they will see." She wiped her tears, and together they rewrote the drawing, this time bigger, stronger, and clearer. It was as if the universe was testing their patience. Every failure, every insult, every hunger-filled night was like a wall between them and the sky. But every time they climbed over that wall, even if it left them bruised. There came a point when even the boy, the stronger of the two, began to doubt. He looked at his sister one night and whispered, "Maybe they're right. Maybe the stars are too far. Maybe we should stop." The girl was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "The stars may be far, but they are not impossible. They look down on us every night. If they can travel millions of miles of darkness to shine here, why can't we travel a few steps toward them? Her words became his strength. The struggle went on for years. They applied to small competitions, wrote essays, and sent letters to city schools, asking for guidance. Most times they received no reply. Other times the answers were discouraging. But every rejection only fueled their fire. Still, the weight of reality was heavy. The boy's body grew tired from endless work. The girl often fainted from exhaustion after long walks to school. Many times they felt like giving up. But every time when they looked up at the night sky, they remembered why they started. The stars, no matter how distant, seemed to whisper to them, "Don't stop." And so while the world saw them as failures, two dreamers wasting their lives, they silently built resilience. Struggle shaped them in ways no textbook could. Their nights of hunger gave them empathy. Their rejections gave them courage. Their loneliness gave them strength to lean on each other. They were still mocked, still doubted, still poor. But inside, something unshakable was growing, because even though the stars seemed to have banished them, the earth beneath their feet was quietly preparing them for a moment that would change everything. Time moved slowly in the village, yet inside the two siblings, something kept growing. They had faced so much rejection, so many shut doors that they had almost gotten used to failure. But still, they tried. They never stopped trying. One day, while returning from school, the girl noticed a small poster pasted on the cracked wall of a government building. It was faded by sun and dust, but a few words caught her attention. International Science Essay Competition. Open for students worldwide. She stopped and read it carefully. The essay had to be about ideas for the future of space exploration. The deadline was near, only a few weeks away. Her heart started beating faster. She had no internet to send her essay, no computer to type on, no books to quote from. But she had something nobody else had. Years of watching the stars, years of dreaming, and endless nights of thinking. She tore a piece of paper from her notebook and copied the details. That evening she showed it to her brother. At first he laughed. "Do you really think they will read something from us? We don't even write in English properly." But she shook her head. "What do we have to lose? We've already faced so many rejections. Let's try once more. If this is our last attempt, let it be our best." That night, under the flickering light of an old lantern, they began. The boy, though tired from the field, sat beside her. She wrote in her neat handwriting, and he added his thoughts in between. Their essay was not filled with big scientific terms. Instead, it was filled with honesty. They wrote about how the stars inspired poor children in forgotten villages. They wrote about how looking up at the sky gave them courage when the world below pushed them down. They wrote about hope, about curiosity, about the future of humans reaching out to the stars. Every sentence carried a piece of their struggle. Every paragraph carried the weight of their dreams. When the essay was finished, they faced a new problem: how to send it. The competition required typed submissions through email, something far beyond their means. For a moment, it felt like another wall, but they refused to give up. They walked miles to the nearest town carrying their handwritten essay. They entered a small internet cafe, the kind that had old computers and dusty keyboards. The man in charge raised his eyebrows when they asked for help typing and sending an essay abroad. But seeing their determination, he agreed. It took hours. They dictated line by line while the man typed. Finally, with shaking hands, they pressed send. For days, they heard nothing. Weeks passed. The boy returned to his work, and the girl continued with her school. Life seemed the same, hard, repetitive, filled with struggle. They began to forget about the essay, thinking it had disappeared into silence like all their previous attempts. But then one morning, everything changed. A letter arrived at the school. The teacher, who usually dismissed the girl's curiosity, called her name with surprise. "This is for you." Confused, she opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a printed letter in English. She read it slowly, her eyes widening. They had been selected as winners in the competition. Their essay had touched the judges, who were amazed that children from such a humble background could write with so much depth and sincerity. The teacher stared at her, stunned. The other students whispered in disbelief, but the girl could hardly hear them. Her hands shook as she ran home to show her brother. Together they cried, not out of sadness but out of relief. For the first time in their lives, someone had believed in their dreams. The prize was beyond what they had imagined. They were invited to the city to attend a science exhibition and receive recognition. It was the first time anyone from their village had been invited to such an event. Their family was speechless. Neighbors who once mocked them now gathered around, curious and surprised. "Is this true? Our children are going to the city because of the stars?" The siblings felt nervous but excited. The journey itself was a miracle. They boarded a bus, then a train, wide-eyed at the speed, the noise, the endless view of places they had never seen before. The city was overwhelming. Tall buildings, bright lights, endless crowds. But in the middle of that chaos, they found something they had longed for all their lives: acceptance. At the exhibition, they were welcomed warmly. Their essay was displayed among works from students across the world. For the first time, they did not feel like outsiders. They stood among people who shared their love for science and the stars. Journalists interviewed them, amazed by their story. Some asked, "How did you write such an essay without resources?" The boy smiled and answered simply, "We wrote with our hearts." It was not just recognition. It was a door opening. People who read their essay began to see them differently. Some professors encouraged them to study further. A few organizations even offered small scholarships. For the siblings, it felt like stepping into a new world. The stars that once seemed to push them away had finally pulled them closer. But perhaps the most beautiful part was how they felt inside. Standing on that stage, holding their certificate, they remembered every insult, every rejection, every night of hunger and doubt. And suddenly it all made sense. Every struggle had been preparing them for this moment. When they returned to their village, the air was different. The same neighbors who once mocked them now greeted them with smiles. Children who once laughed now asked questions about stars. Even their parents, who had feared for their future, looked at them with pride. Yet deep down, the siblings knew this was only the beginning. Recognition was good, but their dream was not about fame. Their dream was still the same as the very first night they lay on the rooftop, to reach the stars, to learn, to explore. That night, back on their rooftop, they looked up again. The stars twinkled as brightly as ever. The boy whispered, "Do you think this is the universe forgiving us? First it banished us, now it welcomes us." The girl smiled softly. Maybe it never banished us. Maybe it was waiting for us to be ready. For the first time, they did not feel alone under the night sky. Their struggle was far from over, but hope had entered their lives in a way it never had before, and with hope everything looked different. The journey to the city had opened their eyes to new possibilities. For the first time, the siblings had seen what life outside their small village could look like. They had met people who believed in them, people who respected their passion instead of mocking it. But when the celebrations ended and the awards were handed over, an important question remained. What next? They had two choices. They could try to escape their village forever, leaving behind the dusty roads, the endless fields, and the people who once doubted them. Or they could return home, carrying the light they had discovered, and share it with those who had none. It wasn't an easy decision. The boy often thought about moving to the city. There were opportunities there, maybe even scholarships for further studies. He had seen libraries full of books, classrooms filled with equipment, telescopes that they had only dreamed of. He imagined himself staying behind, chasing a bigger life. But his sister thought differently. "If we leave," she said one evening as they sat by the window of their small home, "who will show the children here that dreaming is not foolish? Who will tell them that they too can reach the stars?" Her words touched him. They both remembered how lonely they had felt when no one understood them, how lost they were when even teachers and neighbors laughed. If they left now, other children would go through the same, and so the siblings made a choice that surprised many. Instead of running away, they came back to their village, not just as dreamers, but as teachers. The first night after their return, they gathered the children of the village on their rooftop. There was no classroom, no blackboard, only the vast night sky above. The girl pointed at the stars and explained how some were part of constellations. The boy described how the moon changed shapes from a thin crescent to a glowing full circle. The children listened with wide eyes, some for the first time realizing that the sky was more than just distant lights. At first, only a handful of children came. But word spread quickly. Soon more children started joining, sitting cross-legged on the roof or on the ground below. Even some curious parents stood at a distance pretending they were just watching, but secretly listening too. The siblings had no fancy tools. They used chalk on broken tiles to draw star maps. They filled notebooks with simple sketches. Sometimes they used glass jars filled with water to show how light bends, or they made small models of planets using clay. Their teaching was not perfect, but it was filled with passion, and passion has a way of reaching people. Slowly, something changed in the village. The same neighbors who once mocked them began to see value in what they were doing. At least the children are learning something, they said. Some even began sending their kids regularly, realizing that education could be more than just memorizing textbooks. For the siblings, it was not about proving anyone wrong anymore. It was about giving children the hope they once craved. They knew not every child would become a scientist or an astronomer. But if even one child learned to dream without fear, that was enough. Still, their journey was not free of obstacles. Resources were scarce. Books were few. The boy worked extra hours in the fields to buy simple supplies for their classes. The girl often walked to town, persuading librarians to lend old books. Sometimes she even copied entire chapters by hand because they couldn't afford to buy them. There were nights when exhaustion weighed them down. After teaching children for hours, they still had their own struggles to face: household chores, work, family responsibilities. Yet every time they thought of giving up, they remembered how far they had come, from being mocked and lonely to being respected, from being dreamers in the dark to guiding lights for others. One evening, as they ended a session, an elderly man from the village approached. He had been one of their harshest critics years ago, always calling them foolish. But now, with softened eyes, he said, "I was wrong. What you are doing is good. Our children see the world differently now. You've brought something new to this soil." The siblings didn't say much. They only smiled. Forgiveness came naturally because they understood. Sometimes people fear what they don't understand. As months passed, their rooftop gatherings grew larger. Soon there wasn't enough space to hold everyone. With the help of a few supportive neighbors, they cleared a patch of land and built a small open-air shelter with bamboo and cloth. It was simple, but it became their first classroom. On clear nights, they held star sessions where children lay on the ground, staring up at the sky while the siblings explained constellations and stories behind them. On cloudy nights, they told tales of scientists who had once been ridiculed, but later changed the world. The children began to ask questions, lots of questions. Questions about planets, about rockets, about whether people could live on Mars. The siblings didn't always know the answers, but they never discouraged curiosity. "If we don't know," the boy would say, "then let's find out together." That simple approach made all the difference. Years rolled by, and what started as two siblings on a lonely rooftop slowly turned into a movement. Youngsters from nearby villages began visiting, curious to see the place where children learned under the stars. A local newspaper even wrote a small article about them, calling it "A Classroom Where the Sky is the Blackboard." But the most beautiful part was not in the recognition. It was in the transformation of the children. The same kids who once mocked the siblings were now part of their classes. They no longer laughed at dreams. They asked bigger questions. They thought differently. And most importantly, they started believing that their lives could be more than what the village had decided for them. For the siblings, this was the greatest reward. Not certificates, not prizes, but the simple joy of watching young eyes glow with curiosity. One night, as they packed up after a long session, the boy looked at his sister and said, "Do you realize what we've done? We were once banished by the stars, but now look, we've brought the stars down to Earth for others." She smiled, her eyes shining in the dim light. "Yes, and this time the Earth has welcomed us home." And so what began as loneliness turned into belonging. What began as rejection turned into acceptance. The siblings were no longer dreamers in isolation. They had become guides, mentors, and a symbol of hope. The sky above was still the same, endless and full of mysteries. But for the first time, the village below looked different, alive, curious, and ready to embrace dreams. Years passed, and the little rooftop classroom had grown into something larger than either of the siblings ever imagined. What began as whispers in the night had become voices of many children asking bold questions. What began as two lonely dreamers had become a community of learners. The siblings were no longer seen as outcasts. In fact, they were now looked upon with respect. Villagers who once mocked them proudly said, "These are our children. They brought honor to this place." Parents encouraged their kids to attend the evening classes, and even elders sometimes joined quietly, pretending they were only watching but secretly learning too. Still, the siblings knew there was more to be done. A rooftop and a bamboo shelter were good beginnings, but they dreamed of something bigger. A real place where children could touch science, not just imagine it. A place where the sky was not only admired but studied. The idea of building a small observatory began as a whisper between the two. "What if we could get a telescope?" the girl said one evening. "What if children could see the craters of the moon with their own eyes?" The boy smiled, though he knew how impossible it sounded. They barely had money for daily needs, let alone for an observatory. But impossible had never stopped them before. So they began small. They saved every bit they could from their work. They wrote letters to organizations, to universities, even to strangers who might care. Most letters were never answered. Some replies were polite rejections, but a few people believed in them. One kind professor sent them his old telescope. Another organization donated a set of books. Slowly, piece by piece, their dreams started to take shape. After years of effort in a small open field near their village, they built a modest observatory. It was not made of steel or glass like the ones in the city. It was a simple structure built with local materials, but inside it stood a telescope, the first the children of that village had ever seen. On the night they opened it, the whole village gathered. Children lined up eagerly, waiting for their turn. One by one, they peered through the telescope. Gasps filled the air. "I can see the moon," a little boy shouted. "Look, it has holes on it," a girl exclaimed, staring at the craters. For the first time, the stars were not just dots in the sky. They were worlds within reach. The siblings stood nearby, watching the children's faces glow with wonder. In that moment, they felt everything they had endured. The hunger, the ridicule, the loneliness had been worth it. The stars that once made them feel banished were now drawing their community together. News of the observatory spread beyond the village. Journalists came to write about it. They called it the place where the stars meet Earth. Visitors from nearby towns arrived, curious to see this unlikely center of learning. Some even offered donations to support the project. Slowly, what began as two children's dream became a symbol of hope for many. But perhaps the most touching change was within the villagers themselves. The same people who once said, "Stars will not feed you," now proudly told others, "Our children study the stars here." They realized that while stars might not grow food, they fed something else: imagination, courage, and belief. And sometimes those were just as important as bread. The siblings continued to teach not just about astronomy, but about life. They reminded the children that failure was not the end, that questions were more powerful than answers, and that curiosity was the beginning of change. They encouraged them to dream, whether it was about the stars or about building schools or even about becoming better farmers with new ideas. Years flowed like rivers, steady and unstoppable. The observatory stood strong, a quiet witness to countless evenings of laughter, learning, and wonder. Children who once sat under the stars with wide eyes grew up and went on to study in cities. Some became teachers, some became engineers, some pursued sciences, and each of them carried the memory of the rooftop classes and the observatory that first made them believe. For the siblings, this was the greatest reward. They did not need fame or wealth. Seeing the next generation grow with courage and curiosity was enough. One evening, as the sky turned a soft shade of purple, the boy and girl, now grown, stood together outside the observatory. Children were gathered inside, peeking through the telescope. The laughter of young voices filled the air. The boy looked at his sister and said softly, "Do you remember the nights when it was just us? When people laughed and called us foolish?" She nodded, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "I remember. But look now. They no longer laugh. They learn." He smiled, a quiet smile of peace. "We were banished by the stars once. But see, the Earth welcomed us back. Maybe this was always our home." The stars twinkled above, but this time they did not seem so far away. They were not symbols of loneliness anymore. They were companions, guides that had led them through rejection, through struggle, and finally back to acceptance. And so, the story of two dreamers came full circle. They had begun as outcasts, mocked for daring to look up. But in the end, they had brought their entire world to look up with them. They had built more than an observatory. They had built belief. The sky remained endless, filled with mysteries still unknown. But the earth, the very soil that once doubted them, had finally embraced them. They no longer felt banished. They felt home.